Here at the Black Information Network, we know how important it is for you to start your week off energized, engaged, and enlightened. There are always major stories that break over the weekend, and we feel you should know about the ones we are talking about today. So stay tuned for our weekend recap featuring BIN News Network anchor Katie Gray. This is the Black Information Network Daily Podcast, and I'm your host, Ramses Ja. All right, Katie Gray, welcome to the show. This is your first time hanging out with me. Give us a quick, brief introduction of who you are and maybe something cool going on in your world, just so that we know who we're talking to when we get into these stories.
Right? No, honestly, I'm so honored. I'm so excited to sit down with you. I've been looking forward to it, honestly.
Yeah.
I am definitely a news girl all the way through and through. I just love the fact that I get to research these stories and get to report on these stories and then get to tell everybody else about them. So I'm so excited to dive into the content with you.
All right. Well, I'd love to get your thoughts. First up, we're going to talk about the 8 black men who were temporarily removed from an American Airlines flight over a complaint about body odor, according to a new lawsuit. So on Wednesday, a lawsuit was filed on behalf of 3 of the men, Alvin Jackson, Emmanuel Jean Joseph, and Xavier Veal, against American Airlines alleging, quote, blatant and egregious racial discrimination, unquote, per Axios. The lawsuit states that 8 passengers were kicked off their January 5th flight from Phoenix, Arizona to New York, quote, without any valid reason and solely based on their race, unquote. New quote, representatives of American told them that they were removed from the flight because of a complaint about a black male passenger who allegedly had offensive body odor, unquote. This is according to the lawsuit. The 8 men weren't seated together and didn't know each other. According to the lawsuit, the men didn't have any offensive body odor and, quote, at no time did anyone ever specifically accuse any of them of having offensive body odor, unquote. New quote, when plaintiffs pointed out that they were being treated unfairly due to the color of their skin, at least one of the American staff members said she did not disagree, unquote, the suit reads. According to the lawsuit, the 8 men were initially told they would have to be rebooked on a different flight. However, quote, only after determining that there were no available American flights, unquote, that day, the airline reversed course and told them they could reboard their initial flight. So I remember when this story first broke. Obviously, there's a lawsuit now. So, give us your thoughts. Talk us through this one a little bit, how it hit you.
I mean, there's definitely a couple different factors that definitely jump off the page that I think really deserve to be unpacked.
Okay.
Is the fact that, we are talking about 8 separate people. And, I'll start out with the lighter version, the lighter thoughts on it, which is, we've heard different cases over the last few years about, different issues that have elevated where people have been kicked off flights. And unfortunately, a lot of them were situational, right? Behavioral, where either passengers to one another or to flight attendants. This was one of the rare cases where you don't hear often about body odor. I even had to dive into that myself. I found a couple stories back in 2010 and 2017. It is something that airlines do have a right to reserve, but it's not something that you often hear about. So then, obviously the more important aspect to this is that these 8 people did not know each other. All that was told to them was because of a description, because they were black males, they were singled out and they were asked to be removed from a flight. I mean, it's really difficult to look at the situation and not see it as racial profiling. Especially where the only single factor was that it was a complaint that we don't know where it came from and that it was a black male. That's very vague. That's so vague.
Yeah. And I think your point is well made with a complaint like that resulting in 8 black men being removed from the flight. It shows not only what I would feel because as they mentioned, I'm inclined to believe them. That's like an old stereotype, an old racist motif, if you will, that black people smell. We have an odor to us, and we're dirty, and we steal, and we're lazy. And we're brought here to do work for people who really were lazy. Isn't that funny? Anyway, for someone to allege that, and then for them to ultimately determine that none of us have any offensive body odor, right? I'm inclined to believe the black men because That's just it sounds more racist than it may be. But we're all human. We're all mammals, so we have the capacity to smell, I'm sure. But once that part has been determined, then you start examining the layers here. And so the company overreached by far in removing all 8 of these gentlemen. They weren't seated together, as I mentioned, and they didn't know each other, right? So they don't come from the same background. They weren't eating the same food. It wasn't, there was no connective tissue there outside of, well, these guys all have melanin in their skin, so they're all the problem, right? And, according to the article at BINnews.com, the lawsuit further alleges that American Airlines pattern of racial bigotry prompted the NAACP to issue a travel advisory for Black passengers back in 2017. So now what you have is a history of, at least according to the NAACP, what I would call discriminatory practices against Black people. And, to be fair, in a statement, American Airlines said the allegations, quote, do not reflect their core values or their purpose of caring for people. But this is an unfortunate, thing that happened. But, the truth is these gentlemen, for whatever trauma it is that they've endured, for whatever embarrassment that they've endured, just because imagine being removed from an airplane in front of all the rest of the people on the airplane, inconveniencing all of those people, inconveniencing yourself.
Well,
over
singled out
body
that
odor
way where
complaint.
yeah, exactly. Being singled out where it's like you're standing up in front of all of these people and being escorted off a flight. And also recognizing that in the article, you only have 3 out of those 8 that went ahead and stepped up to press charges.
Mhm.
Because, that also does take, to some degree, guts.
Yeah.
Acknowledging the fact of like, hey, this isn't okay. And I want to make sure that the company maybe has a little bit more level of accountability.
There you go.
To prevent this from happening again, because it wasn't okay for me and it shouldn't be okay for somebody else.
Well said. Well said. All right, moving on. A white writer is facing backlash for disguising himself as a Black man for research for his new book. On last Tuesday, Sam Forster took to X, formerly Twitter, to announce the release of his book, Seven Shoulders, Taxonomizing Racism in Modern America. Forster noted that he disguised himself as a Black man to gain a firsthand account of racism in America. Quote, last summer, I disguised myself as a Black man and traveled throughout the United States to document how racism persists in American society, unquote. This was according to a tweet, and this tweet was alongside a photo of his book cover. He continues, writing Seven Shoulders was one of the hardest things I've ever done as a journalist. It's out on May 30th. So this one had a lot of people online talking. I think I understand kind of what he was trying to do, but that it's like another form of blackface. And again, you're never going to get the full measure of the Black experience. But there were a lot of folks that were taking this as offensive. I think I tend to have a little bit more grace for people that are trying their hand at allyship. But let's get your thoughts here.
I love that you said that because there was right on the surface, you have like your initial reaction, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where a part of you goes, do we know better? Like, are we doing this? We're having this dialogue, right?
Yeah.
And you're right. My piece to it too, especially from a journalistic standpoint, is, I think it's very sensitive to want to admire people that are trying to educate themselves and they're trying to step outside of their own perspective and what they know to be true or their experience.
Sure.
But then you're right. We've also have to then have the further conversation to that there's a right and wrong way to go about it. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the rare stories that you're right. I read the story and I actually really admired more so some of the comments, some of the responses from the story from people that articulated really well about how you can't really encapsulate that and how necessarily it simplifies, that perspective to try to think that you can pretty much, you're right, do blackface and being able to understand like a different perspective. Right. I think in many different ways, wholesomely exemplified more so the ignorance and insensitivity towards the topic, and did the opposite, especially because, like, you know, you're right. Like if he genuinely, my thing too, from a journalistic standpoint, you know, we are trained and we are constantly always put in the position where it's not supposed, the subject is supposed to be what it is, and it's not supposed to be about us. And I think that in this case, from a journalistic standpoint, he tried to put himself in the story, and he missed the mark, because it could have been a series. The book could have been a series of essays and interviews that he had, and sit down conversations that he had from different people in the community. But he chose not to do that. He tried to do this in a very different way, that obviously is causing a lot more backlash.
Sure. And I think that, you know, you're probably a more traditionally trained journalist than I am. I've spent most of my life just kind of being a normal person. So not quite as cool as you just yet, but I'm working on it. In any event, I think that I have to put on my journalistic hat, and that requires some effort for me. But the thing that comes most naturally to me, and obviously longtime listeners of the show will know this, that you know, I work in the allyship space. You know, my radio show Civic Cypher kind of exists to foster allyship between our various tribes in this country, and I recognize that a lot of people they have challenges, you know, when it comes to that, because they don't know how to best show up for their Hispanic brothers and sisters, their Black brothers and sisters, et cetera, right? And, you know, on the one hand, we'll say, hey, you need to listen to Black people, right? You need to listen to Black women, right? And that's very true. And on the other hand, we'll say you can never understand the Black experience, no matter how much listening you do, unless you walk in our shoes, which is also true, right? And I could see people becoming very frustrated with trying their best to immerse themselves in Blackness to gain perspective and to gain understanding, maybe increase their capacity for empathy, and then having to deal with the backlash that comes with at least some facet of Black America, or whatever facet of America they're trying to support, taking exception to how they go about cultivating a relationship with these different tribes, right? And so that's how I look at it initially. And then the journalist in me says, okay, I need to look at both sides. I need to look at what he was doing, and then I need to look at people's reaction to it. And so a little bit different approach, but I think that, you know, you and I both are going to end up in the same place, which is by accounting for both facets, both sides of this. I think that we are exercising best we can our capacity for understanding and for gaining perspective. And while, you know, everyone can learn a little bit of a lesson here and there and everywhere else, you know, there's been stories like this that have happened in the past. There have been Black people doing that, and on and on. And sometimes it's for comedic effects, sometimes it's for, you know, research purposes. But you know, again, on the one hand, I can read stories about white women, try to figure out what their life is like, and be very intentional about that and never know. And then I can dress up like Sean and Marlon Wayans and White Chicks and try to have that experience and never know. And, you know, I know that full well. And, you know, for some people, it just doesn't really come to them so easily. They have to like walk through it in order to learn. And so I'm not too mad at him. I just I hope he's learned a little something and he's a little wiser. And sure, maybe he's learned something that we all can benefit from. So I hope folks, you know, if his book is really well-intentioned, I hope it sells well and that he makes an impact with it. So
join us for the National Urban League Conference in New Orleans, July 24th through the 27th at Hyatt Regency, New Orleans. Don't miss out. Register today at nulconference.org.
This is your weekend recap with today's guest, Black Information News Network anchor, Katie Gray. All right, next up, a white woman has been sentenced after she appeared to encourage a group of girls to attack a Black teenager in a video that that went viral. According to BBC, the 41-year-old Winnie Connors was sentenced to 20 months in prison after pleading guilty to intentionally encouraging or assisting an offense. The attack against the black teen unfolded near Thomas Knevet College in Ashford, Surrey, in February 2023. Video shows Connors and a white teenager approaching the black girl before the adult instigated the beating. "Get her," Connors repeated several times during the video. The white teenager hit the victim repeatedly before more girls joined in on the assault, kicking the black girl and pulling her braids. Quote, "Punch the face off her," unquote, the adult yelled. Several reports stated that Connors was the mother of one of the girls involved in the fight. In October 2023, one of the teen attackers pleaded guilty to assault occasioning bodily harm. She was ordered to pay a fine and issued a restraining order. A second teenager also later confessed to an actual bodily harm charge in connection to the attack. Okay, I will say this. I've had a tough week. And, you know, I sort through a number of traumatic videos in a week. And I have learned over the years that I've been doing this type of work that I have a limit. And in order to protect my peace, in order to preserve my capacity to empathize and sympathize, I do not want to become desensitized to violence against Black and brown bodies. As a result, I have not seen the video, but I know that you have. And so I'm going to lean on you for your reaction, having seen the video, and then, of course, your thoughts to what is now happening in the aftermath.
I mean, what I think is so difficult about situations like this is that, you know, if we apply the lens critically and we dissect it that way, right? Where just right off the bat, if I began telling this story and I said there were a group of teens and there was an adult that was egging on and incentivizing violence, even at that point, it's not really, it's not difficult to kind of already see that this is a, you know, this is a terrible situation that it's really hard to justify this parent by any means. Like the fact that this was an adult woman who was encouraging violence, but then also layering in that layer of recognition that you did have a group of white girls and a Black girl that was being targeted, and that you had an adult that was witnessing this happening. And not only did she not prevent it from happening, but it was encouraging it. Yeah. They also mentioned to you, like the mom who was recording the video, the woman that was recording the video was also a parent to one of the girls that was participating in the violence.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah. I don't know if there is too much to be kind of unpacked there.
Yeah, you know, the thing that about these videos is that oftentimes what will happen is I will see videos of kind of the opposite. It'll be Black girls beating up on a white girl, and they're sent out and shared. You know, I subscribe to some conservative and indeed far right white nationalist forums because I need to understand what the opposition is thinking, what media they're consuming, so that I know how to have intelligent conversations that chronicle narratives accurately. So oftentimes I'll see kind of the inverse video like these, where again, it'll be Black girls beating up on a white girl. And I know enough of this to know that this thing is not exclusive to white people. It's not exclusive to Black people. But I do know that historically, Black people have suffered more underneath this type of dynamic, which is why stories like this are particularly sensitive. And the inverse stories are unfortunate. Absolutely. We're all human beings. We don't want to see anyone get hurt, especially a child. But there's not the same particular sensitivity associated with white victims as there are with Black victims, because historically Black people have been victimized by white people and terrorized by white people and hung from trees and lived short, hard lives where they spent most of their time afraid of white people, right? So this is something that we understand. But then you start to dig into the deeper layers here, which is this child that, was being encouraged has probably grown up with a warped perspective on her place in the world, her value, and indeed the value of the Black girl. Because for a parent to show up, to see what's happening, to encourage a beating against a Black girl, a person who historically has been marginalized. Indeed, this adult had to know that this child's mother was marginalized. This child's grandmother was marginalized. This child's great grandmother was probably enslaved, and going all the way back. And you can kind of make those connections, and is indeed teaching her child that this sort of violence is an appropriate response to whatever happened before that. I think that, this flies in the face of that narrative of, we're going to wait for the old generation of racists to die out so that we can, remake the world in a more progressive way. It shows that racism is taught. It shows that violence is taught. It shows that, we need a different strategy than just waiting, because these people are active and clearly they're coming for children too. And so, something to be mindful of. Moving on, social media is buzzing after former President Donald Trump was found guilty in his New York hush money trial. On Thursday, 12 New Yorkers tapped to sit on the jury unanimously found Trump guilty of 34 felony counts of falsifying business records related to hush money payments to adult film star Stormy Daniels amid the 2016 election. The jury took 2 days to deliberate before reaching their decision. A felony conviction for a former president is unprecedented. So we're going to talk about, because everyone knows this, we're going to talk about kind of the reaction on social media, because social media users quickly took to the internet to share their thoughts on Trump's verdict. I certainly had my own, but I'd love to hear what you've discovered and your thoughts as well.
I mean, honestly, one of the things that cannot be said enough is that this really is making history, right? I mean, this is the first time that we've ever had a former president and also someone that's running for that office again. Convicted. Mm-hmm. Like I will say I was very taken back too, because the way that the trial was going about, the jury members, inevitably, even though you have in many different cases, they were advised, not to participate in social media or to read anything about the case outside of it, all of those things. But what's really interesting is that it's like, with how major this case was and how major Donald Trump is, you can't, those jury members had to be biased to some extent, right? And when I say biased, just obviously had their own views, whether they supported him or not, going into this trial, and still evaluated all of the evidence in front of them to make that decision. And found him guilty on all 34 counts. So I think what is really interesting is it's not as much my reaction towards them finding him guilty. It's more so I'm really curious to keep a close eye on what does that mean for all of us going forward, right?
Sure, yeah.
Because now we have a major decision of, we in this country have made a decision that legally, people who have been convicted of any felonies have lost their right to vote, right? But we now have the decision. Does that mean that they get to run for those offices that they technically wouldn't be allowed to vote in?
Yeah, that's an interesting place to find ourselves.
Here's
the thing about this one in particular. So first thing is, he had been complaining about whether or not he'd get a fair trial in that district because he was polling so low there. He said that before, during, and after the trial. But his defense knew that going into the jury selection process, right? And so they were able to vet jurors that some would have maybe a pro-Trump stance, and then dismiss some of them who had a really strong anti-Trump stance, right? And so they went through the process of picking the 12 jurors that would ultimately decide his fate. On social media, and indeed Trump himself is, the people on the right, on social media at least, are suggesting that this was an unfair trial. And that kind of flies in the face of the facts because, they had a chance to sort through their jury pool and pick the jurors who were most likely to give Trump his best possible chance in court. They weren't voting for Trump's presidency. They were determining whether or not Trump falsified his business records to pay hush money to an adult film star that he had an affair with to affect the outcome of the 2016 election. And there were people that told the story. There were people that he paid the money to. There were records, there's business records. And everybody involved was like, yep, that's what happened. And that is evidence. And the jury had to convict based on that. Here's what happened. Here's the signatures. Here's the timeline. Does it make sense? Beyond a reasonable doubt, did this happen? All 12 of them said yes, that this specific thing happened. They weren't voting whether or not he should be the president. They were deciding in a limited fashion, did this thing happen? Right. And they determined yes. So, I heard that the appeals court is like all black women. So good luck with that. And then, of course, he might appeal again to the Supreme Court, in which case he's kind of stacked that in his favor. And somehow the Supreme Court will be like, oh, clearly this didn't happen. Although everyone else, we all know it happened. Right. And I want to add one more thing here. The other thing about the witch hunt thing that I've seen, Trump said, of course, but it's also very prominent on social media. Donald Trump, and this is on my social media, because I put a take together the other day. So you can check it out. It's at Ramses Jow or at Civic Cypher, either one. I put it up somewhere. But Donald Trump is the same person that has had 20 plus accusers since the 70s of sexual assault, sexual violence, groping, unwanted kissing, all this sort of stuff, right? He's the person that bragged about owning the, Miss America pageant, go backstage and check out the women in various stages of undress. And I think more importantly, he's known for being this playboy. Before the presidency, he was known for being this playboy, right? He wanted that image. He cultivated that image. He leaned into that image. And one thing that is undeniable is that we all heard him say, when you're a celebrity, they let you do it. You can walk up to them and just grab them by the blank, right? So this all fits within the character that he established for himself, that we all know. And his narrative, the narrative he once chronicled, is that he is a victim of a political agenda and that this is a witch hunt and that none of these things ever happened. And for those of us that are looking for what is the most likely explanation for this, it's all there and it's been there. But for those of us who have subscribed to the Trump, I'll say it, cult, there will never be enough. It should have been enough when he said you can walk up to him and grab him by the blank. We should have known who we were electing back then. And now for us to pretend that this is a witch hunt, it's such a frustrating thing. But in short, that's my social media take. And a lot of other people, at least on the left, tend to agree. And of course, the MAGA crowd is like, oh, it's a political agenda. The Biden crime family is out to get him, whatever. So what are you going to do? All right. Before we let you go, I know that there is a story that is coming out of Florida. I wanted to get your thoughts on. So this is from NBC News. The Florida sheriff's deputy who fatally shot a U.S. Air Force airman while responding to a report of a disturbance has been fired, the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Department said on Friday. An internal investigation of the May 3rd shooting found Deputy Eddie Duran's use of deadly force that ended in the death of Senior Airman Roger Fortson was not reasonable, according to a statement from the sheriff's office. Quote, the objective facts do not support the use of deadly force as an appropriate response to Mr. Fortson's actions, unquote, Okaloosa County Sheriff Eric Aiden said in the office's statement. Fortson, 23, was fatally shot when he opened the door of his apartment in Fort Walton Beach, about 40 miles east of Pensacola, after Duran knocked and announced the presence of law enforcement, the sheriff's office said. Fortson opened the front door and the two faced each other. the office said. The airman had a gun at his side, pointed down, and did not aim it, and did not resist the deputy before Durand opened fire, it said. So give us a little bit more here, because I know this story has had some developments that have taken place over the weekend, and I know this is one people are following pretty closely.
Oh, no, absolutely. Because honestly, even when the story first broke at the beginning of May, I mean, the devastation. So his family obviously have been very vocal. He's actually originally from Atlanta, just been very vocal about wanting to have the results and wanting to know more about the in-depth internal investigation that was going on.
Sure.
That now we have that update that the officer who did open fire has been fired since. Yeah. But it was just, there's so, very similarly, the reason why so many people were following this case is there's so many layers to it, right? The fact that even at the time, the description of the investigation, he was wearing his uniform. We have a situation where we technically have two men of uniform and one open fired. And the interesting aspect too is that the reason why they mentioned too in the case that he didn't immediately open the door, the officers were at the wrong place. Yeah. They were at the wrong apartment. He did nothing wrong. He was not a criminal. He had not committed a crime. He, as far as we were aware, we're just at his residence where he was stationed and opened the door because someone's banging on it. He had the weapon face down, according to body camera, and was shot multiple times. Yeah. Killed. And it's one of those things that I think that there's still so many questions because of the fact that, this investigation, while we understand that whenever something happens like this, there does need to be an investigation. There does need to make sure that we're making sure we're crossing all our T's and dotting all of our I's. But there was so many aspects where, why we know obviously this isn't the first situation where we have someone that was shot in their home. Sure. Where the police were at the wrong place, right? Yeah. And it's one of those questions where even the higher ups, it's like, what's next? While the person that pulled the trigger has now been fired, there's still so many other questions about how did we even get to that point? How did they go to the wrong location? How did it come to the point where it had to escalate to shots being fired? Yeah. Especially when there does have to be a level of accountability and critical thinking applied when we are talking about a mistake that ended in someone losing their lives, their family members and their loved ones are now having to mourn their death. And he was only 23 years old. Yeah. I mean,
yeah, this is a sad story. But I think that there's a lot more that this is a much bigger conversation, about guns and their place in society. And I've been having this conversation for a long time. I'm the old guy yelling at a cloud on a hill. But, in the meantime, before we get up there, I just want to let the listeners know that this is a story that we're following. You're following it personally. So, make sure that you let folks know your social media and how they can tap in with you and follow along.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, honestly, like my Instagram, my X, which was formerly known as Twitter, it's Katie Gray TV, and they can definitely follow me. Yeah, I mean, it's these stories that they are devastating and they are really hard to, follow. And I completely understand. I mean, obviously warning anyone who, when they read the details of this, it is devastating, obviously. But I do think that there's something to be said about, these conversations need to be happening and these stories need to be heard because the fact that we do have them happen and trying to figure out, one way or another, especially right, aside from even just the gun piece to it, I think that it's really easy for everyone to recognize, innocent people shouldn't be shot, and lose their lives. And, working towards something to prevent that from happening. I think everyone kind of agrees on that, just the details of how to do that. We got to figure it out. And I'm not pretending I know the answer.
Well, I do. I'm up here yelling at a cloud. So
yes.
Anyway, in the meantime, oh yeah, you're funny. Well, in the meantime, thank you for your time and your insight. Let's do it again soon. This has been a joy. Once again, today's guest is Black Information Network news anchor, Katie Gray. This has been a production of the Black Information Network. Today's show was produced by Chris Thompson. Have some thoughts you'd like to share? Use the red microphone talkback feature on the iHeartRadio app. While you're there, be sure to hit subscribe and download all of our episodes. I am your host, Ramses Ja, on all social media. And join us tomorrow as we share our news with our voice from our perspective, right here on the Black Information Network Daily Podcast.